Hello and welcome to another Movies I Watched vlog. It's been a while, in fact it's been about 2 months, so I've got so many great films to bring to you today. I hope you enjoy my quick look through some great films that I've been watching over the last 2 months. And we start off back in May with 2010's Black Swan. This is a film I've wanted to watch for a long time, but never got round to. Nina strives for perfection as a ballet dancer ahead of a new production of The White Swan. She's so committed, however, that she's unable to let go and release the looseness that she needs to take on the Black Swan alter ego character needed, unlike her more free-willed friend Lily. She must cope with brutal competition, her sexually abusive director, overprotective mother, and the mental and physical toll of the world of professional ballet. The way that Black Swan is shot really makes you feel you have an intimate connection with the main character, stuck in her bubble and privy to her most innermost struggles. You experience her own anxieties firsthand in a way that makes Black Swan uniquely claustrophobic and unnerving. Portman is utterly brilliant in this, one of her defining performances, and I've given Black Swan 5 out of 5. Really enjoyed this creepy psychological thriller. From the sublime to the ridiculous next, 2004's Anchorman, The Legend of Ron Burgundy. Ron Burgundy is a newsroom legend until he meets his match when the first female anchor sweeps in to threaten his television dominance. Will Ferrell and friends lampoon 70s TV and all the powerful male news anchors of the time. He's in his element here in one of his funniest films with one of his most memorable characters. A mirror is held up to the misogynistic excesses of the time, but in the funniest and most satirical ways possible, and I've given Anchorman 4 out of 5 stars. A concert film next. Came out this year, but it was from a never before released footage from Carole King's performance at Central Park in 1973. Carole King has been a songwriter of the most memorable chart hits as far back as the 1950s, but it took some persuasion and confidence to come out as a performing artist in her own right. She was shocked by the incredible success of her first release as a singer-songwriter, Tapestry, in 1971, which gave her a new lease of life after her partnership from co-writer and husband Jerry Goffin dissolved. By 1973, she had more confidence, again with a bit of encouragement from her friends like James Taylor, to perform her largest concert at Central Park as a solo artist. She manages to create an intimate and soulful performance even in such a large outdoor event and has the audience captivated from the very beginning. It's perhaps not the most spectacular live show you've ever seen, but it's a worthy live testimony to one of the finest songwriters of her generation at the height of her powers, and I've given Carole King Home Again 3.5 stars. One of the most disturbing films I've ever seen before Threads from 1984. I had the delight of going to a local secret nuclear bunker, to actually watch this, which really added to the tension. In Sheffield, we meet Jimmy and Ruth, a young couple on the precipice of life together. That's until the bomb falls, and life is irrevocably changed. Threads is by far the most disturbing film that I've ever seen. Not because it has any great special effects or visuals, but because of how relatable and normal it feels for these people to go through such a devastating event. You've walked those streets, you've met those people before. This could so easily happen to you. You get to know the characters first before the disaster happens. This isn't some CGI-laden disaster flick. This is a very real hell arriving to day-to-day Sheffield, with normal lives that are suddenly cut short by nuclear punctuation. That's what the film does so well. It presents the banality and familiarity of life, ripped apart by such a terrifying and likely threat. I was actually in shock when they first showed Threads to me at school. What were they thinking? I literally couldn't talk for about an hour or so afterwards. So traumatised was I by what I'd seen. No other film has had that effect on me. A few years ago I rewatched it, predicting that I'd find it quaint and cute as an adult who had become sensitised to horror. I couldn't be more wrong. It's every bit as harrowing after all these years. Threads is probably the most realistically brutal film there is, the most powerful and genuinely disturbing film that I've ever seen, and the ultimate anti-war statement. And I've given Threads 5 out of 5 stars. There's nothing quite like it. Another musical documentary next that came out last year. I was unfortunate in not being able to see this on the IMAX. I wish I had done. But it's Moon Age Daydream, a documentary all about Bowie and in particular his alter ego of Ziggy Stardust. It's a journey through the mind of a true artist in every sense of the word, and a celebration of the cultural impact of David Bowie through all of his guises. It's a fascinating psychological study of one of the most influential icons of the 20th century, framed by a combination of own words and an erratic collage of engaging archived footage. I've been a fan now of Bowie for over 35 years, and yet still find the man to be an enigma, a myriad of contradictions and endlessly intriguing. He's so erudite and intelligent in sharing his own unique view of the world that you can't help but hang on his every word. As with all high art, there's a fine line between being inspirational and pretentiously cerebral. There were times when it was all a bit too much for me to take all this philosophical grandiosity of the man in interviews, as much as I do love him. A lot of this seemed to come from a desire to constantly conflict with the interviewer, and of course the effects of serious drug use on Bowie. There's a shocking level of psychopathy presenting itself in his analysis of himself. Not in the most aggressive movie image of the psychopath, but in the medical terminology of a person who's an empty shell, emotionally, as he describes himself in the film, who can only become full and actualised by the absorbing of different cultural and character influences. But his importance as a cultural explorer and its effect of challenging gender, sexuality and cultural norms is undeniable, and his flirtation with different spirituality and philosophy is compelling too. Plus, if you're a fan of Bowie's music, it's a highly exciting and singable party and treasure trove of lesser seemed clips. Probably the best documentary on Bowie there is. I definitely recommend you watch Moon Age Daydream if you're a Bowie fan, and I'm giving it 4 out of 5 stars. More musical documentary and live footage next from the Summer of Soul, or When the Revolution Could Not Be Televised. This is a documentary featuring 1969 footage of the Soul concert in Harlem. In 1969, Woodstock was the most famous festival in the world, but just 100 miles away, another incredible concert was happening with the very best soul acts playing to 300,000 residents of Harlem. The footage was canned for some 50 years, but is now presented in a new and restored format. Along with the incredible live music are testimonies from those who were there, who share the cultural significance of the festival in a time of racial and political tension as the dream of the 1960s descended into the mistrust and fear of the 1970s. I'm so impressed with the quality of the picture and the sound here, which makes you feel like this happened yesterday, and you're right there in the atmosphere of the day. I really hope they bring out a Get Back style extended Blu-ray of this with all the full musical sets, because as interesting as the documentary is, I'd love to see the unedited performances in full. Summer of Soul is half music concert, half piece of historical document, and it's all excellent. And I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I checked out an early Kubrick film that I've been wanting to see for ages, from 1957, Paths of Glory. A French corporal during the Great War, World War I, must defend his platoon after they refuse to go on a suicide mission. This is one of Stanley Kubrick's first films, and it shows the horrors and psychological effects of war and the difficult ethical dilemmas every man faced. Kirk Douglas is totally compelling as the corporal, and the depiction of the brutality of war is refreshingly realistic and grim for its time, never sugarcoating or glorifying it. The way in which the generals are presented as unfeeling, removed and tone deaf to the plight of their men, combined with the injustice that the soldiers face at the hands of their own army, is a particularly biting critique of war. I have 1 or 2 minor criticisms of Paths of Glory. First, the American cast make very little attempt to portray French characters. And secondly, the structure of the film doesn't quite know where it wants to drive its point home, dragging on slightly after the shooting of the men that had felt like the climax of the film. These are only nitpicks, of course, in what is a very powerful film indeed. As you'd expect from Kubrick, the camera work here is superb, really throwing you headfirst into every scene. His use of tracking and close headshots makes this a war film that is ahead of its time, both in its telling and in its execution. And I've given Paths of Glory 4 out of 5 stars. I finally got around to watching the classic Seven Samurai from 1954 this month, or last month as it was. A village's harvest is pillaged every year, leaving them starving. In desperation, they decide to find and hire samurai warriors to protect them. The action film that set the blueprint for so many action films and westerns that came after it, most notably The Magnificent Seven, which was a western remake of The Seven Samurai. Also a huge influence on a young George Lucas and other directors that came down the line. Seven Samurai feels like an epic western, even with its feudal Japanese setting. And if you're a fan of films of John Ford or Sergio Leone, you'll no doubt find a lot to love here. The heroic films of Kurosawa no doubt helped reclaim some of Japan's pride in their history and legends after their brutal loss at the end of World War II, 9 years earlier. And this tale of good versus evil has a real timeless quality to it. I did find Seven Samurai perhaps more impressive than enjoyable, with the melodramatic acting and screechy, shouty dialogue a bit too irritating for my liking at times. That's not to say I didn't find it entertaining for the most part, and I'd recommend you check it out if you haven't already. And I gave Seven Samurai 3 out of 5 stars, which I realise is sacrilege. But I can only go off how I enjoyed the film. A Hammer horror film next, The Viking Queen from 1967. Really didn't enjoy this one. I love the Hammer films, but this was one of the weaker entries, I thought. I've only given it 1.5 stars. Hammer brings this lavish but overly earnest historical drama to the screen, loosely depicting the revolt of Queen Boudicca against the Roman forces in Britain. Whilst the dialogue has all the entertainment of a Shakespeare by the book adaptation, the settings and production feel more in keeping with the Carry On films. Plus there is the small fact of some rather fast and loose accents throughout. Some great shots here and there and fairly entertaining bank holiday fluff, if not much else. And finishing off May's film watches was 1988's Willow. Ron Howard's expensive family flop earned enough of a cult following to eventually be turned into a series on Disney Plus some 34 years later, which then flopped too. The first vehicle for the young Warwick Davis after he stole all our hearts as Wicket the Ewok in Return of the Jedi. Willow is a fun frolic with some welcome twists to the usual 80s fantasy conventions. Our main hero is a dwarf, whereas the dashing swordsman is the anti-hero, and the damsel in distress causes more distress than she finds herself in. There are many elements that don't really work for me in Willow, such as Davis's strange American accent and lack of authority in the role, and the hit-and-miss dialogue and performances of the rest of the cast also suffer too. But the special effects are impressive for the time, including one of the first uses of morphing effects. Davis is charming and likeable enough, and the action is pretty consistent in this 80s oddity. And I've given Willow 3 out of 5 stars. And now into the films that I watched in June, starting off with the rather strange Harold and Maude from 1971. Young Harold is obsessed with the macabre, finding new ways to fake his own death and hanging around funerals of people he's never met. At one of these funerals, he meets Maude, an eccentric septuagenarian with a zest for life and a devil-may-care attitude. My old friend before he died recommended 2 films to me that he thought I'd love, If and Harold and Maude. I decided to save them up for a time when I most missed him and could connect with him through watching his recommendations. I finally got around to watching this one. This unconventionally strange and dark comedy will definitely not be for everyone. The subject of suicide is of course nothing to laugh about, but Harold's consistent attempts to shock his stone-cold mother with his ever-increasingly ridiculous displays does raise a giggle from time to time. Harold and Maude has such a unique feel, and the 2 odd ducks at the centre are unforgivable. Harold and Maude has such a unique feel, and the 2 odd ducks at the centre are unforgettable. Maude is particularly inspiring in her unique outlook and the way she encourages Harold to see the joy in art, music, and seizing the absurdity of life. I did enjoy the film, but perhaps not as much as I would have liked to. The romantic connection between the 20-something with the baby face and the 70-something Maud was inappropriate to me, and unnecessary really, in a story that was driven by such a sweet and life-affirming friendship. I've given Harold and Maud 3 out of 5 stars. A bit of a weird one, and no doubt will improve the more I watch it. The Great Gatsby next, from 2013. To his shrink, an author recounts his life-changing encounter with his eccentric and living myth neighbour Jay Gatsby and the excesses of the roaring 20s America. 2013's The Great Gatsby is beautifully shot with a unique metaphysical style that really draws you in and shakes you up. The inclusion of on-trend music does date it slightly and jerk you out of the historical context. But the set pieces are just so theatrical and lavish, which perfectly fits the indulgent of the times, at least amongst the party classes. And the mysterious story will keep you hooked from the beginning. And I've given The Great Gatsby 3.5 stars. Another film that I've wanted to watch for ages, probably about a year or so. I don't know why I've never got round to it, but it often comes up in conversations. It's 2019's Midsummer. After Danny loses her whole family in the most tragic way, she decides to tag along on a Swedish holiday with her boyfriend and his friends. Here they are introduced to one of his friends' commune or sect of pagan worshippers. As they delve deeper into the customs and traditions, they become increasingly aware that their own safety and survival is at stake. Midsummer is a hugely creative and well-made take on the folk horror genre, with a lot more brooding suspension and intensity than your usual shockfest. I was particularly impressed by how the film portrays the polite civility of horror as the abnormal becomes normalised in a group of doctrinated people. This brought to mind other affecting psychological horrors like Rosemary's Baby and, of course, The Wicker Man. The production was also excellent, with impressive sound design and trippy camera work. A notable addition to the pantheon of classic horror films and essential watching for any fan of the genre, and I have given Midsummer 4.5 out of 5. An absolute classic and favourite of mine from 1990, Goodfellas, was next. Young Henry Hill dreams of being a gangster. He starts off small, running small errands as a kid, but soon graduates to the big time of big crime. Scorsese proves once again that he is one of the top filmmakers we have, with this stylish and consistently engaging crime drama. The casting is absolutely spot on, with all the main characters portraying their characters to perfection. I've never been a big fan of gangster flicks, but Goodfellas and the Godfather trilogy transcend their genre and have so much more to give. A sign of this is how Scorsese manages to make you root for the utterly deplorable characters on Goodfellas. I've given it, of course, 5 out of 5 stars. Absolute essential viewing. A bit earlier now, 1965's Up the Junction. The life and trials of young working class people in 1960s London is dramatised in this kitchen sink play. By today's standards, the acting and accents may seem a little bit cod, and some of the portrayals may even seem a little insulting. Yet what really made this story stand out for me was the experience of working class women living in these times, something that's rarely discussed in this era of films. You really get a sense of the vulnerable position that they were in before the pill, having to deal with lecherous married men and dangerous backstreet abortions. Up the Junction is a well-made snapshot of flip-side swinging London in the 1960s, and I've given it 3.5 out of 5. Yet another musical documentary next. I've watched quite a few of these recently. Joy Division from 2007. It's a great documentary about one of the most important bands to come out of the late 70s post-punk era. Interviews with the surviving members of the band and the people who knew them best, alongside rare archive footage and discussion of the social and political background that informed their music. Well worth a watch, and I've given it 4 out of 5 stars. And lastly, another horror film that I only remember little bits of and really wanted to go back and watch, 1981's Scanners. We enter Cronenberg's world of telepathically gifted individuals and their dangerous powers to control and destroy other people's minds. It's a bit of a hidden gem, this one. I remember clearly seeing the scene of a guy's head explode, but little else about scanners, so it was good to see the whole film again. It's a fairly simplistic story which takes itself maybe a little bit seriously, but there are some great actors in there, such as the wonderful Patrick McGowan. And if you're a fan of Cronenberg's brand of psychological suspense and memorable body horror, you'll no doubt find a lot to enjoy here. And I gave Scanners 3 out of 5 stars. So that's it. A whistle-stop tour through 2 months of film watching. I've watched some really great films this last couple of months, and I hope you've enjoyed my small reviews about them. Let me know in the comments below what films you've checked out over the last month or so. And as always, thanks so much for watching, and take care.